Hi there. Welcome back for another midweek boost. We're Simon and Maren, your relationship coaches, and we're very excited to be here during this month on sex and sex hormones and intimacy. And we're very excited to be here today.
And once again, we are going through some highlights on the Passionate Marriage book by Dr. David Schnarch. And I'm going to be reading some passages from here today, and we're going to be having a discussion on sexual intimacy this week.
So, as we think about sexual intimacy, as you may remember from what we've talked about already, this really starts off with how do we differentiate ourselves? And when we talk about differentiation, it's really the idea that we are two individuals who are bringing ourselves into the relationship and that there's a space and energy between us. And we want to start there, even as we talk about sex and intimacy.
And one of the key um, dynamics, I guess, in a intimate relationship is the tension between independence and wanting to be an individual and the desire for connection and closeness. And that can get really difficult to navigate in any intimate relationship. But the author says this is the path to intimacy.
One of, one of the things to keep in mind is sexual desire, sexual intimacy is really one of the most vulnerable actions that we take as individuals. And so when we think about being in that vulnerable space, how can we be vulnerable? How can we be authentic? And how can we stay in this place, holding on to ourselves, even when we're at our most vulnerable?
So I'm going to read a few things from the book that define sexual desire, human sexual desire. And this is what the author puts down. Human sexual desire is the most complex form of sexual motivation among all living things. It's a combination of genetic programming and variables of life experience, producing the utmost sophisticated nuance and variety of sex in the face of the planet.
That's a pretty amazing statement to make. Very bold statement. But as you can think about what we've talked about during this month, from how do we interact with our sexual hormones, what can we do about our sexual hormones, what are the impacts of our sexual hormones for both men and women, you can see there's definitely a physical and genetic piece to this. But now we're starting to say, how do we actually recognize the emotional vulnerability, the emotional openness that's needed for healthy sexual desire and intimacy. And Dr. Schnarch is really talking about this, and that's why he's really saying it's really in one of these most complex settings that we have on the planet.
Mm-hmm. He actually defines nine characteristics of sexual desire. So I thought we'd just go through those and Simon, jump in if anything comes to mind as we're going through these. So, one we've already talked about a little bit is that biological programming to reproduce our species. And to me, there's a big interaction there with the sex hormones. Next one, relieving tension. And the third one, which these three are the most commonly thought about, according to this author, is the craving for sexual gratification. So it's the pleasure principle that also includes avoiding pain.
So when we think about those, just those three alone, and again, we've talked a lot about the biology during the course of this month, but we sometimes think of relieving tension or craving sexual gratification as something negative, and actually, it's part of the sexual experience, and so it's not a negative or a positive; it just is. And so we want to kind of put that into our processing as we think about sex and sexual intimacy.
Now, there are six more characteristics of sexual desire, and the author says these are the most commonly overlooked things. One is sexual desire is part of our interpersonal communication system. And I mean, Simon and I have done a lot of videos on nonverbal communication, tone, where our eyes are looking, how we're moving our body, that energy and the vibe. But we actually didn't really specifically talk about sexual interactions being a form of communication.
Absolutely. And so think about when you've had maybe good sexual experience and when you've had maybe not so good sexual experiences. What are some of the differences between that? And it often isn't about the physical. it's usually about some way that the interaction, the energy between people are maybe not going as well, or maybe there's more of a negative energy rather than a positive energy in the space. And so now that doesn't tend to lend itself to healthy sexual intimacy.
The next one, sexual desire partly reflects our longing for pair bonding. And to me, this goes back to his other point, is that tension of I'm an individual and yet I am drawn and I have the longing for togetherness. So there is this pair bonding that is part of that sexual desire. The next one, sexual desire expresses an eagerness to exchange meanings with another person through sex.
Really interesting concept, because I think we want this intimacy and we think about intimacy in a very sexual, very physical way. But what we're really saying is that there's this overarching desire for this deeper connection, this deeper
Mm-hmm.
intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And sex is one of the ways that we do that. It's not the only way we do that. We do that in terms of how we interact in lots of different ways. And one of the things that you may have recognized in your own lives is when you have a good emotional connection, there is an enhancement of sexual desire that actually leads to a greater intimacy.
Mm-hmm. The meaning part also is making me think of the stories in our head, which we talk about quite often. It's because our brain puts meaning and puts story to our experiences. So this can be on maybe the negative side, or stories that really cause a lot of angst and anxiety, or it can be more on the positive story, the positive meaning making.
And some of the examples of that might be, if you're a guy, maybe you have a little bit of erectile dysfunction, maybe you just have a lot of stress, which leads to performance issues. Very common. In fact, over 50% of people over the age of 40 will have some form of erectile dysfunction. So again, very, very common. And we need to be very open about it. And one of the things that we often see in that is, depending on the way the interaction goes, maybe it's that little look of disappointment, or maybe it's that, um, whatever it is, it's that just little bit that can actually lead to even poorer
Mm-hmm.
performance as a result of those little things that happen. And for women too, if your sexual partner is looking at you and maybe you just see this little glance that you interpret as, oh, he doesn't like my body, or he doesn't like the way I look, or whatever it is, that meaning that we put
Mm-hmm.
will really negatively impact that sexual intimacy. The opposite is just as
Mm-hmm.
true.
Yep.
And so, again, if there is a lot of encouragement, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of description of the thing that's attractive, those kinds of things can also be drivers that are very, very positive.
Mm-hmm. You're actually hitting on the next one, which is pretty cool, is the passion. And this is how the author puts it: sexual desire includes the intensity and depth of our involvement in sex while we're having it. And he says basically he's describing our capacity for passion.
And that can vary. So again, just because it varies from day to day doesn't mean something's wrong. That's a normal part of the human experience. And so the part of the question is, one, can I cultivate that passion? And second of all, when I do have that passion, am I willing to actually make myself vulnerable in the sexual intimacy and
Mm-hmm.
desire?
Mm-hmm. The next one is sexual desire is eroticism in action. Eroticism involves the ways we want to engage our partner, which feels very closely linked to that passion.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think also when we think about eroticism, that unfortunately has had a lot of negative connotations,
Yeah.
eroticism is actually very positive. And again, really think about it in the ways of what are your desires with your partner, and how open are you willing to be about those desires?
Mm-hmm.
And again, just because you're open, it doesn't mean that your partner is going to do it or okay with that. And that's okay. But the openness actually leads to a greater intimacy and desire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The final one of the author's characteristics is sexual desire, like satisfaction, is partly determined by our culture. He says society shapes what arouses us and how we experience our own desire. And what he uses, for example, is women's bare breasts are sexy in Western culture, but merely pragmatic in African tribes. So there's a lot of cultural connotation that I think we just get fed a lot by media and Hollywood without even recognizing it.
And think about what those messages are telling you in your culture, whatever culture you're in. If your culture is that certain body types are more attractive, or certain ways that men or women act is more sexual, that's more satisfying, those messages aren't necessarily true for you as an individual. And so part of the work is to ask ourselves as individuals, what is satisfying? What is something that I would like in this relationship? And am I willing to share that?
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering what you think about this. There's actually a whole section in this chapter on sexual desire, and the author says the person with the least desire for sex always controls it.
Wow, we're just opening all kinds of boxes here. So I can imagine some of you, when you hear that statement, are like, "Yeah, for sure." And maybe you're the individual who wants more, and your partner is the one who maybe has less desire. And so part of that is normal, right? We don't always have the same level of desire with
Mm-hmm.
each other. And how do we respect each other? How do we partner with each other? How do we enter the space together, even if we're at different places?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's another, I want to say negotiation, but I don't. It's another way of opening up and expanding
Yes,
communication.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see, even as we're talking about this today, a lot of this sexual desire and intimacy is actually not about the physical act of sex. It's actually about all of these other pieces. So think about what family you grew up in. How did they view sex? Was sex seen as something open you could talk about? Is sex seen as something bad you don't ever talk about? Is sex only in the context of marriage? Is sex seen as specific acts of sex rather than more open styles of sex? So again, all
Mm-hmm.
of those things are going to really change the way that you talk about sex, that you're open to sexual discussions, and how you might interact with your partner as a result
Mm-hmm.
of
The encouraging thing is that these are all things that we can practice and we
it. Absolutely.
can learn new skills and we can grow in terms of communication, in terms of differentiation, in terms of even like learning about this stuff by reading a book. So that's encouraging because once again, by rereading this book, I'm remembering the author says it's challenging to be married, and yet that when we face that challenge, we're going to experience greater satisfaction and intimacy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think this is a really interesting quote. One property of marital systems is the vulnerability, and you've been mentioning that, of increasing importance of one's partner. Your partner's increasing importance over time naturally increases your vulnerability, which in turn fosters, get this, sexual boredom and low desire. Wow.
Wow. So how would you describe that? I mean, in sort of other terms.
Everyday
Yeah,
language.
everyday language.
Um, I I would describe this, and you fill in what you're thinking is um, the more our intimacy grows, the more I feel vulnerable because you are more and more important to me, and I feel more and more connected to you. So if I'm going to choose to open up my heart more and love Simon more deeply and enjoy our connection more deeply, then the fear of what happened if I lose you
Right.
increases as well.
Right. And so, I think part of it is when we think about that fear leads to that low desire. That fear kind of fosters that sexual boredom because we almost don't want to explore further because it actually increases intimacy and connection. And so
Mm-hmm.
those fears can actually be drivers to not actually exploring as well. And then that leads to this boredom or this low desire as well. And we have some core fears that he
Mm-hmm.
talks about. The fear of losing your partner's acceptance. Now, that comes out a lot in sex, but I can tell you that is very common in any relationship. Our sense of acceptance, our sense of the importance somebody has in our lives makes a big difference. And so if we are in an interaction where I feel like I've lost Lauren's acceptance of who I am, that's probably not going to lead to a great sexually intimate time. And the other fear is that you may lose your partner altogether. And so again, that those fears increase with increasing vulnerability. And so we have to be willing to hold on to ourselves and say, hey, this person is somebody that really matters to me, and it's a little scary,
Mhm.
and I'm willing to dive in.
Mhm. Yeah. So here, this is what he says about that. Are you among those who might dare to want your partner? That's the diving in part, right? Then you have additional reason to remember what we discussed about intimacy because it applies to desire too. If you want to keep desire and intimacy alive in your marriage, your continued differentiation must keep pace with your partner's increasing importance. When your partner becomes more important to you than your relationship with yourself, you only have four choices. And those choices are withdraw emotionally, try to engulf, take over your partner, allow your partner to engulf you, or raise your level of differentiation.
So think about where you might be in your own relationship. The engulfing of these relationships is really what we call enmeshment or codependency.
Mhm.
And so we're really, when we withdraw, that's actually a defense mechanism to, because we're in this sort of fight flight mode. And so it gets really scary because of the level of vulnerability and these
Mhm.
fears we've talked about. And so then we pull back. So what we're challenging each of us, and ourselves
Ourselves
include,
too.
is how do I raise that level of differentiation? So as I want more and more, as I feel this desire more, I have more of a fear of loss, more of a
Mhm.
fear that I'm not going to get accepted. And how can I say, well, in that, I'm okay. Whether Lauren accepts me or not, I would
Mhm.
like her to accept me, but I am still a full, whole being on my own. And
Mhm.
so that's what we're calling ourselves to.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really well said. And it's a tricky concept. Once again, you could listen to what we're sharing again if you want to, or listen with your partner, or get the book because really the whole book interweaves exactly this point throughout everything he talks about.
Absolutely.
Now, I wanted to talk about some practical things on how to increase the intimacy and specifically sexual intimacy. So we're going to talk about three things if you want to add something in. Once again, these are in the book, so you can go and read more details. But the first one is one that you might have even heard us talk about before. It's I would say, the simplest, maybe
Yep.
easiest,
Yep.
and it's called hugging till relaxed. Do you want to describe that?
So I want you to think about the last time you hugged somebody. How long did you hug them for? 2 seconds? 5 seconds? Maybe 10 seconds? And
That's a long time for
that
hugging.
and that's a long time. And in that, there was one person leaning into the other.
Mm.
So hugging till relaxed is really, it's difficult. It sounds simple. I'm gonna tell you right now. The first time we did it, we were
Super uncomfortable.
super uncomfortable, right? So what you want to do is you want to stand with your partner, and you want to stand close, and you want to hug them. But what you want to do is stand on your own balance. Each person is not going to lean in. We're just going to stand and hold each other. Now, I want you to do that until you feel you're relaxed and your partner is relaxed.
Mhm.
I'm going to tell you, it'll take a little time the first time you do this because there is some anxiety that gets built into this. You're actually moving into a differentiated
Mhm.
space that is actually vulnerable because you're always wondering, what is the other person thinking? What are they doing? What are they going to do next? Rather than, I'm going to enjoy this moment with this person that I really care about.
Mhm.
And it's a interesting technique. And again, what we tend to do is kind of lean into each other. We're asking you to actually stay in your own balance, your own feet, and not lean into each other and just hold each other. And you will actually notice that relaxing. both from a physical standpoint, you'll notice the
Mhm.
muscles relax, you'll notice the tension kind of release.
Mhm. And it's really an invitation because you're not going to be talking. This is not about like giggling or making each other laugh, but really the invitation is to notice yourself in the midst of the connection. And this is, I would say, the easiest way to practice is because do this with your clothes on.
Right.
Do this in a way that isn't about sexual
Yep.
touching.
Yep.
And it's really to notice what stories are coming up, what thoughts, what am I feeling in my body? Am I trying to shift back and forth? Do I have an itch that I feel like I need to move? Do I want to laugh because it's uncomfortable? But really, all of that noticing in the midst of the invitation of, can I settle in and be okay in this place of vulnerability?
And being present in that moment.
Being present. Yeah.
And again, it's challenging. After the first few times you do it, it'll actually become easier. But it's a great way to kind of dive into this a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, the second tool or tip that we're going to talk about is also about being present and awareness, but it's interacting sexually with our eyes open. And I don't know, what are your initial thoughts? Why do you think that's important?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how many of you have your eyes closed during sex. Um, Most people do. It's actually pretty common. It's actually more common to have your eyes closed. And when we ask ourselves why are we closing our eyes, is because we're trying to concentrate, and we don't want any distractions from the other person that will take us off of our path, right? We've kind of got a mission. We're trying to get to that
Oh,
place,
that's kind of funny
and
though.
and we don't want any distractions from it. And yet what that actually means is we're isolating ourselves in the midst of the
Yeah,
interaction.
yeah. Which I guess is one way of pulling into
Hmm.
that individual. Um,
And emotionally pull it like, yeah.
Emotionally, that individual versus the actual connection.
Hmm.
So the invitation is just experiment with that. Experiment with opening your eyes, experiment with looking at the other person, experiment with making eye contact, and notice once again what's coming to mind and what's happening with your body.
And I would say, I mean, again, it's was uncomfortable when we started, and I would say we still have to work on that to kind of be intentional to open our eyes during a sexual interaction. And so it isn't something that you can say, oh, I've done it, now I can move on. It's really something to continue to work on, to be present in a relationship, not just in your own body. So we're really trying to do two things. How do you be present in your own body?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you be present in the relationship at the same time?
Yeah. And that is the perfect segue into tool number 3. And that is touching and
Feeling.
feeling. And the author says, like, he asks his clients, do you touch your partner when you have sex? And, people laugh and it's kind of like, well, of course. And yet he says, I'm really talking about feeling the touch, feeling the experience instead of it being more mechanical,
Or
or if we're living in that biology story, then it's easier to disconnect from actually feeling the experience.
or it becomes about outcome, right?
Mm.
I mean, that's the other piece that can be a driver.
Mhm.
So again, when you think about how we touch people in a sexual way with your partner, I would even start just by touching lightly the skin and just actually feel it, actually be present with it.
Mhm.
And vice versa. As I'm doing that, Martin has a chance to feel it,
Mhm.
not just okay, that's nice, but really experience it.
Right. It's another thing that you can practice. Actually, all 3 of these tools you can practice with your
Yeah,
clothes on without really a sexual
yeah.
um, experience at first. I mean, even looking, eye to eye or gazing in each other's eyes, if that feels super uncomfortable with your clothes on, start there.
Yeah, because it's going to be more uncomfortable with your clothes off. That's right. That's
um,
right.
But really, the touching too. I mean, just even sitting, maybe if you're watching your show, or even holding hands. So it could just be lightly, it could be holding hands. I think of maybe massage, but really it's what's happening
Inside,
internally.
right?
Mhm.
I mean, even try this. Even when you're uh, giving a passionate kiss, keep your eyes
Mm,
open on and what are your lips actually feeling? So
mhm,
it's a way to sort of combine some of these tools in a way that
mhm.
can really help drive
Yeah.
some of that desire and intimacy.
Yeah. And we're just going to remind you that it's great to practice and it's great to experiment. This is not something, like if you notice part of your internal talk is beating yourself up or being really judgmental towards yourself or your partner, like that's really important to notice
Hmm.
and to dig deeper with, to keep exploring, because we're giving you tools to practice. And if you've never practiced this before, it might feel awkward or clunky or ridiculous. Um, and these are really, really good tools to increase intimacy.
So we hope these tools and this discussion has been helpful. Again, we recognize that this is somewhat of an uncomfortable topic. It's very vulnerable. If you are open to sharing in the chat, great. Please feel free to text us or reach out to us privately if you have questions or if you have challenges. Again, we're here to provide support. We're not a sex therapist, that's not who we are, but we do recognize that relationships have so many different pieces to them, and sexual intimacy is an important one. So, again, we're here to support you. Again, this month is all about sexual intimacy from the physical side as well as from the emotional side. And we're really glad you're here and listening.
See you next time.
Bye bye.